part of the problem here with the discourse on immigration is that there is a focus on individuals who cross the border, and there's not enough focus on policymakers, the structures and forces that are causing people to decide to leave their homes and come to the United States. I said Dennis Hastert, your member of Congress, was an enthusiastic supporter of the North American Free Trade Agreement. What NAFTA has done to Mexico is caused so much destabilization in the Mexican economy, especially in agriculture, that American grain, American corn, is now sold at a cheaper rate in Mexico than locally produced grain. As a result, Mexican farmers are simply unable to compete. If you think about it, farmers in Iowa and farmers in Nebraska and in Indiana, the Corn Belts, benefit from huge subsidies from the federal government. They benefit from a very heavily mechanized agricultural system in this country. You don't need a lot of workers, a couple of tractors, and you're plowing tracts of land by the millions. And so the American farmers have dumped a lot of grain onto the Mexican market, and the Mexican farmers are simply not able to compete with that. The Economic Policy Institute and the Institute for Policy Studies have actually done studies showing that up to 6 million Mexican farmers, their families and workers have actually been displaced. They've lost land. And many of them trek to Mexico City, where they live in slums, circling the city, and eventually they trek north to find work in the United States. Then the Dennis Hasterts of this world, the politicians in Washington who championed NAFTA, show up at the border and say, we're the protectors of the American people. We want to protect Americans from these invasions. We're going to build a wall. And nobody holds them accountable for that fateful vote in 1993 when they voted for NAFTA. So I say this to say that the fixation with people crossing the border is exactly what's wrong with this debate. One of my mentors when I was at university, when I left Miami University and went to Ohio State University, Mario Cuomo came, and he was a visiting professor at Ohio State for a semester. And I remember talking to him, and something very profound he said kind of stuck with me. He said, you know, one of the worst things that happens in this country is that we make our laws based on emotions. When in the heat of the moment, politicians jump in and they want to make law. Whether it's sometimes a child that's murdered, and we want to name a law after that child, or those laws almost like, you know, the idea of registering criminals sounds, you know, a very benign, simple thing. You commit a crime, we should force you to register on the internet and so forth. But then you find that vigilantes misidentify somebody, and they take matters into their own hands, find out a person has been, is on that registry, and they kill him. There have been instances of individuals who take the matters into. So it's a much more complicated thing. But those kinds of laws are, sort of the examples that Mario Cuomo was giving. 9/11 is another example of that, where the Congress within 48 hours moved in to pass the Patriot Act, and it's just bad law. Immigration sort of follows this pattern, where there's this emotion that the issue evokes, and Congress has been moving very quickly in 2006, for example, to pass a draconian immigration bill that fortunately was defeated, the Sensenbrenner bill, which sought to call people who are crossing the border felons and essentially criminalize what is just a simple civil offense. So part of what we want to do as an organization, as Jobs is Justice, and across the country with our partners and allies in the labor movement, is to make that shift, to shift the discourse away from individuals who are really emblems, who are symptoms, symbols of public policies that are being made in Washington and other centers of power. Trade deals that are made in Washington, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which, by the way, in the 90s when NAFTA was being debated, the issue of immigration came up. NAFTA was sold as an antidote to undocumented immigration. I remember the debate, some of you might remember, when Al Gore was debating Ross Perot. And he specifically said that if NAFTA passes, it was going to mitigate against undocumented immigration. It was going to create jobs in Mexico, and that everything was going to be fine. They sold NAFTA by telling Americans that it was actually going to slow down immigration from Mexico. It has had the opposite effect. In fact, from 2005 and 2007, actually from 2005 and 2008, 1.5 million Mexican jobs have been lost in just a span of 2 years. And immigration has gone up in the same time frame by 2.5 million people sort of crossing the border into the United States. So it continues to be a problem because of this question of the Mexican economy being essentially invaded by well-advantaged American companies. Another thing that we want to bring to the attention of the public is this. It never comes up in the discourse around immigration. Wars are implicated worldwide for dislocating people. Today, as we speak, the Iraq War has caused 3.9 million Iraqis to be refugees outside their own country. 2.5 million Iraqis are now internally displaced. They're going to end up someplace as immigrants. And I wonder if somebody in Washington will take responsibility for voting for that war in 2003. But chances are that if the debate goes on the way it has been going, we're going to look at those immigrants and wonder why they're here and demonize them. In the meantime, the people who make these decisions in Washington are not held to account. If you run into people from Vietnam in this country, people from Laos, from Cambodia, from Nicaragua, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, you can name the country. Chances are they're here today because a decision somebody made in Washington, D.C. To go to war in Central America. You remember the wars back in the 80s, the Central American wars involving the Contras. You remember the Vietnam War and the millions who were displaced as a result of that. So that these decisions are consequential. Public policy, legislation, decisions that people make in Washington has consequences. One of those consequences is that people are displaced. War is one of the most destabilizing forces in the world. And if you look at the Congo, 5 million people have died already in the past 5 years, and hundreds of thousands of Congolese are coming to the United States. There too, there's complexity. The Congo was used by the United States, was used by Western countries as a staging ground for their efforts to retard Soviet adventurism in Southern Africa during the Cold War. But in return for that, the dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, extracted impunity from the West and from the human rights community by essentially saying that you can use my country to retard communism in Southern Africa, but in return, you may not challenge my human rights record. You may not hold me accountable to what I'm doing to my people. So in the Congo, during the span of 30 years during the Cold War, you never had any sort of civil society developing in that country. Organizations that came up, whether the women's groups, labor unions, or child welfare organizations, they were either co-opted by the government or they were killed off. The leaders were killed off. At the end of the Cold War, Congo found itself with virtually no identifiable, no credible civil society. And so you see the results of that today with the tremendous instability in that country. So this sort of policies cause massive dislocations of people. It ought to be part of the discourse on immigration. Climate change is also emerging as a serious dislocating force. In 2005, 20 million people across the world were designated as climate refugees in 2005. In 2010, 50 million people are going to be climate refugees. In 2050, 150 people across the world are going to be designated climate refugees. These are people who are moving from their land because they can no longer till it, they can no longer grow food because of radical changes in the weather. The United States is producing 25% of the greenhouse gases, and yet it's 5% of the world's population. It is clearly implicated in climate change and has to take responsibility for the dislocations that are going on because of changing weather. The whole question of human rights and what the West has done, oftentimes in recent history, to prop up regimes that are implicated in human rights abuses. I don't have to name them here, but you can look at Chile, you can look at South Africa. If you see South Africans here in the United States, many South Africans came here during the apartheid years, and yet the West was clearly on the side of propping up and supporting the white regime, the white government in South Africa that was abusing its people, and people left South Africa because of untenable, the just abhorrible human rights situation in that country. So when we speak of immigration, it has to be seen in that kind of context in which decisions are being made in Western capitals, decisions are being made in the centers of power, decisions are being made in corporate boardrooms that have consequences on the ground, and they're impacting the ability of people to eke out a decent life. One of the issues that is also emerging right now is clearly a problem connected to trade that I alluded to early on, is this question of what's happening to countries in the global South as a result of the model of trade that we are seeing today, that is aided and abetted by the trade agreements like NAFTA, like the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and a number of bilateral trade deals that the United States has cut with individual countries. Because part of what's happening is that when factories leave the United States and go and set up in another country, take Bangladesh. When factory owners leave the United States to take advantage of these trade deals, when they enter that market, it is the terms of entry into that market that really raise serious questions about the responsibility of the United States and the responsibility of these trade agreements to the people in the global South. Because factory owners are putting a lot of pressure on local elites to create, quote unquote, business-friendly environments. I want to put my factory in your country, but you got to help out. You got to help us out by creating a business-friendly environment. What that typically means is that you have to actively suppress labor unions that are going to be interested in organizing this plant. You're going to have to do something about child welfare advocates who are going to come around to poke around to see if kids are being used in this factory. You're going to have to do something about environmentalists who are going to be concerned about discharge into the local water and into the local air. You're going to have to do something about those women's rights organizations that are going to be concerned about how women are treated at this plant. So what you see there already is the unraveling of the building blocks for democracy. That you really can't have democracy without unions. You can't have democracy without women's rights organizations. You can't have democracy without child welfare advocates. You can't have democracy without environmental organizations. That is essentially civil society that makes the fabric of democracy. So as a condition of entry into these countries, what we're seeing that trade agreements are facilitating this destruction of democracy, of the democracy project itself in the global South. And so what happens, you pick the example of Bangladesh, is that when people can't fight to join a union and improve their own lives at that factory, they start moving, they start leaving, and they move someplace. They typically want to come to the United States. And so once again, they can't be the target of attacks as immigrants because then people just don't decide to get up some morning and leave their families and leave their pets, leave their high school friends, and say, geez, it'd be nice to just go to the United States because it's a great place to be. What sort of the harshness of the discourse in the United States has really failed to appreciate the enormity of that decision that people make. That it isn't easy. I speak myself personally as an immigrant. It's awfully difficult to leave, no matter how poor people might be. It's very difficult for them to leave their own country. So we want to really create an understanding of how this is happening across the world. The United Nations has said through a report in 2006 that at any given moment in the world, 191 million people are in a state of migration. They come in, it's not just the United States, in Spain, in France, in Great Britain. Brazil is a destination for lots of immigrants. So there are a lot of countries that are experiencing this phenomenon. But the institutions and centers of power that are making these decisions cannot be left out of this debate. They cannot be left out of, their role certainly has to be scrutinized. So what we're proposing is that In the case of the United States, 12 million people are now here, they're undocumented immigrants. The question that arises is, what do we do with 12 million people? No one I know seriously thinks that you can round up 12 million people and send them back home. I do know that most Americans, most people in this country are awfully uncomfortable with the idea that 12 million people can remain on the margins of the economy, on the margins of politics, with no rights in perpetuity. I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and it just has a bad resonance with the people of this country. So the next question then becomes, what exactly do we do with them if we can't deport them? Our position is that there has to be a path toward the legalization. That in fact, those people who are concerned about workers' rights in the United States have to worry that keeping 12 million people with no rights, keeping 12 million people disenfranchised, actually exacerbates the employment problems of Americans. Because when people have no rights, when those 12 million people don't have any rights, that's precisely who the employer wants. The employer wants to hire somebody who's not going to raise any questions, somebody who's not going to complain about low wages, somebody who's not going to complain about unsafe working conditions. That's precisely who they want. So if you're concerned about workers' rights in the United States, you ought to take the position that the best way to do that, the best way to shield and to inoculate American workers is to confer legal status to immigrants. Because then, once they're no longer afraid, they can join hands with American workers. They can organize, they can join unions. They can go beyond that and really start talking about a much broader politics around healthcare reform, around living wage laws across the country, around climate change. All of those problems people can solve together because they're collaborating and coalescing and working as a unified force. The conservatives who now have a newfound concern for black workers, and this is a sore spot for me because we've seen efforts recently by conservative pundits and conservative organizations, right-wing anti-immigrant groups, to recruit African Americans into the anti-immigrant cause. To their credit, the African American community has just absolutely refused. You are not seeing any sort of active anti-immigrant activity within the African American community. The reasons are, I think, quite obvious. I won't go into that. One of it is, obviously having a history of being on the receiving end of injustice. I think it informs how one looks at other victims of discrimination and abuse. But it's also a lot more other reasons for that. But it's very interesting to me that conservatives who at every turn have refused to support workers' rights, who for 10 years in the Congress sat on the minimum wage. The minimum wage stayed for 10 years at $5.15 from 1997 to 2007. The Democrats changed that in 2006 when they took over the Congress and raised the minimum wage. But Republicans, the Republican Congress for 10 years said was just fine with keeping the minimum wage at $5.15. They're ideologically opposed to legislative mandates around wages. They oppose living wage laws, for example. What we push, the idea that we ought to have a living wage, a sustainable wage for workers. They're opposed to that. They're fundamentally and ideologically opposed to the right of workers to organize. Now, so when they come to the African American community and say, we are your partners, we want to defend you as a worker because immigrants are threatening your job, I think the question of credibility comes up. You're really concerned about black workers? Explain to us why you oppose raising the minimum wage. Explain to us why you're opposed to the living wage. Explain to us why you're fundamentally opposed to the right of workers to organize. Unionization has been so profoundly important to the African American community. There would be no black middle class in the United States without unions. You can look around Chicago, Akron, Cleveland, Detroit, and the robust middle classes there within the African American community are direct products of unionization. African Americans came north, oftentimes with very little education in Chicago, and joined the steel mills and worked at Ford Motor Company, at Chrysler, in these factories in manufacturing, and entered the middle class because they joined unions. And so for the conservative for the conservatives to all of a sudden appear and say, we're the friends of African American community, of the African American community, and we want to defend them against immigrants, is a little bit hard to swallow, considering a sort of a history of antipathy to the right of workers to organize. So what we want to build, and what we are building, as a matter of fact, is these coalitions involving African Americans and Latinos in particular, and the broader immigrant community, to talk about what can be achieved together in a spirit of unity. What do we have in common? We have in common education systems that aren't working really well for both communities. That if you look at education institutions within the Latino community, education institutions within the African American community, the underfunding of education, this issue affects both communities. Chronic unemployment in all these communities. The sort of the disproportionate impact that adverse environmental policy has on this community is also, so we're starting to identify issues that can bring both communities to work together. Because there's just when you think about 12 million people and what that means potentially as a voting bloc, we've already, I think, this past election demonstrated what happens when people exercise their power to vote. George W. Bush got 43% of the Latino vote in the year 2000. John McCain barely broke 19% because of the backlash against Republicans for their position on immigration. So that's just sort of a taste of what's to come if we achieve legalization for 12 million undocumented workers. And the fact that most of these immigrants, especially coming from Central and South America, are already really primed for a much more progressive politics when they come here. Somebody who's coming from Guatemala, from El Salvador, has been on the receiving end, most likely, of a tremendous amount of injustice. By the time they come over here, they're sympathetic to other people, other marginalized communities. And I tell black workers about this when we fight for unionization. That imagine somebody who escaped some paramilitary forces in El Salvador, walked from El Salvador to the United States, crossed the border at 120 degrees, and that person is working alongside you, and they want to join a union. Wouldn't you want to have somebody like that on your side as a fighter? So you see just a tremendous amount of enthusiasm among Latino immigrants. Every union organizer will tell you that they are absolutely blacks and Latinos are some of the best people to organize. They don't raise questions, they don't resist, they have absolutely no sense of loyalty to the bosses whatsoever, and they're just really ready to be organized. So for the African American community, if you're just 12% of the population, in politics, numbers are everything, right? That's essentially, politics is about numbers. It's about growing numbers. If you grow your numbers, you increase your power. The potential of 12 million new and liberated voters coming into the political system presents an enormous amount of possibility for a progressive political project in the United States involving Latinos, blacks, and progressive whites. There's a lot of history that sort of is very instructive in Chicago itself with the election of Harold Washington as mayor back in 1983. So we have a history a history that's replete with examples of how much we succeed and how much better we do when we work together as marginalized people and work with sympathetic, progressive white people around the issues of common interest, around reforming the healthcare system, around voting rights, and around improving our education system. So. As we look at immigration, as we look at the new administration, I think they have to be pressured to take on the issue of comprehensive immigration reform, and it has to happen now. I was talking to my good friend Monty, I'm sorry, at the table this morning at breakfast, that when the economy goes south, when things go bad in the economy, immigrants are the kind of low-hanging fruit that become sort of easy prey. They're going to be easy to blame. So one of the fears we have is that in this environment, those who want to divide us, those who seek to marginalize immigrants are going to they're going to renew their attacks, they're going to increase their attacks on immigrants. So it's really incumbent on the Barack Obama White House to really move quickly on the immigration question. There's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. In Chicago, we're planning more rallies on May 1st. We're planning to have millions of people, at least maybe hundreds of thousands of people, maybe not millions, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. Again, we had 750,000 in 2006 who showed up on the streets to protest in Chicago. So that we want to really have a show of force between, by immigrants and their supporters. And by the way, contrary to the kind of narrative that came out of those rallies, 70% of people who showed up at those rallies were actually legal residents. It was people who were already citizens, people who had green cards, family members, neighbors of undocumented immigrant who really came in solidarity with them. And it also, it really explains why in the past 18 months during this election, immigration didn't come up. It didn't come up because McCain knew that this is not a good issue as a long-term proposition for the Republican Party. And so he sidelined, he basically sidelined his Nazis and told them to be quiet for 18 months. And Barack Obama also, I think it was pretty clear that this is not an issue he was really excited to take on. So, it was not debated in this election, but to many of us it was a sign that the fact that they were avoiding talking about immigration really showed that those marches in 2005 and 2006 and 2007 were very effective in sending a message that this was a community that wasn't going to sit down and take the abuse without fighting back, and that in fact we were going to exact a price on those politicians that made the wrong choices. You don't hear of Sensenbrenner anymore. You don't hear of Tom Credo anymore. In fact, it was very strange that the anti-immigrant politicians were the first to go in this election, and that the Republican Party nominated somebody who, oddly enough, was the more progressive Republican on immigration, John McCain, who sponsored the McCain-Kennedy immigration reform legislation. So that's quite instructive. It really comes out of this power that came from the ground, people going out and organizing and sending a message that we are a people that have power. And we are going to organize and we're going to exact a price if you make the wrong decision. So we're hoping to carry that attitude, that unity forward in pressuring Barack Obama, who already is naturally sympathetic, but we know what kind of pressure he's going to be under, especially in this economic crisis. And so we hope that you will be joining wherever you live. You'll be joining those rallies and marches and contacting your elected officials. Certainly in Chicago, we're doing that. We've got so many formations, so many groups that are ready to support immigrants. We have our ARC, a movement reimagining change, ARC 109, that Bill and I are working on, that has brought together a lot of academics and community activists and students to really start talking strategically and smartly about how we shape a progressive future, how we deal with the Barack presidency, how we move this president in a progressive direction, and pressure him to do the right thing and sort of give critical support. We're there when he's doing the right things, and when he's doing the wrong things, we're going to show up in Washington and protest and make sure that he does the right thing. So thank you so much for giving me the time to talk to you. I appreciate it very much.